Hi, Gerhard Bloom here, with Tyranny and Delusions of the Social Justice Movement. So today what I'd like to talk about is the alleged callousness of police towards black lives and black bodies. So when you look at it, it is absolute nonsense. I know in the wake of George Floyd, you had this endless loop from various media sources, CNN, CNBC, and in Canada, CBC, with the Breonna Taylor, the Michael Brown, and then after George Floyd, you had the Jacob Blake incident, and each and every time you see this endless loop, there is absolutely no effort given to look at the details that actually matter when you look into the situation. So Michael Brown, he's the guy allegedly hands up, don't shoot. Hands up, don't shoot. Please shoot him in the back. Well, the police shot him in the front. You don't need to be a coroner. For those of you who are about my age, you'll remember the show Quincy. A coroner who, with his investigative skills can solve difficult, puzzling cases. Well, you don't have to be an expert coroner to identify an entry wound, and if there is an exit wound, right? So Michael Brown had struck the police officer in question, had tried to wrestle the police officer's weapon away from him, and when the police officer told Michael Brown to stop as he was leaving, Michael Brown turned around and charged at the cop. Now, having had previously tried to wrestle the gun away from the police officer, this is a deadly encounter. The police officer, in the use of force continuum training, knows that this is a deadly encounter and is justified in using deadly police force, which he did, and a good thing too, right? So that was a lie, an absolute gross misrepresentation of the facts. Now let's look at Breonna Taylor. Poor Breonna Taylor was with her suspected drug-dealing, gunslinging boyfriend, and the police were executing a no-knock warrant. Well, they did not have to provide notice, ergo the title no-knock warrant, but they did knock. We know this because of police testimony and the testimony of neighbors who said they definitely heard the police knock and providing warning before entry. Well, upon entry, they're greeted with gunfire. Gunfire from the alleged drug-dealing, gun-toting boyfriend of Breonna Taylor. He alleges that he didn't hear the police and the poor frightened drug dealer was protecting his life and shooting back at the police. Well, one police officer almost bled out by virtue of that. And Breonna Taylor, she's killed in the crossfire. Now, turns out her family received a settlement for millions of dollars. Millions of dollars. I think this is morally outrageous. I am not going to shed any Black Lives Matter tears for somebody who's is suspected of being a participant in a violent criminal activity. Drug dealing is a violent criminal activity, ergo her boyfriend's gun, right? In law, this is known as assumed risk, right? If you play hockey and you get slammed into the boards and you lose a couple of teeth, you can't sue the player who slammed you into the boards. It's known as an assumed risk. Now, if you're hanging around or participating in an illegal, violent endeavor, as drug dealing is, you've assumed certain risks. So as the mothers of little black children who are mourning the loss of their innocent children who haven't assumed any risks, they get killed, and these poor mothers get absolutely nothing. And they don't even get media attention. This happens every week in the United States. Mothers are putting their babies and small children into bathtubs to sleep at night in the inner city because of the rampant drug-fueled violence. It's disgusting. And Jacob Blake. Jacob Blake. Are we really supposed to look at the Jacob Blake scenario as though it was a racist attack? Am I really supposed to be outraged? Oh, and before I move on, let's look at the George Floyd situation here. He was a violent criminal. He had a criminal record, violent, and he was actively resisting arrest. Now, this is, you've seen the edited and snippets of the video of George Floyd dying. Well, the jury found the police officer involved, Officer Chauvin, guilty. So I need to pretend that I believe Derek Chauvin was guilty. So I'll pretend I believe he was guilty. Although George Floyd had lethal quantities of fentanyl in his system, and his death is consistent with a death from fentanyl overdose. But I'll pretend he died of police abuse. Tony Timpa. Sorry? Who's Tony Timpa? You probably don't know of Tony Timpa, because Tony Timpa was a white man, and I'm not sure if the videos are still available. I saw the video of Tony Timpa dying in police custody under a scenario that's almost identical to George Floyd. George Floyd and Tony Timpa both died in a restraint hold. Police are taught at the various academies for excited delirium. This is when a suspect is resisting arrest and is obviously high on drugs and isn't complying with police commands. So Tony Timpa died almost in identical circumstances to George Floyd. Nobody, virtually nobody knows about Mr. Timpa and his death. And no, the police weren't charged at all, at all. But we're supposed to look at George Floyd and look at that as police not valuing black lives. It's a lie. And another thing I would add, that those bystanders were representing a threat to officer safety. Now, had that crowd dispersed, Officer Chauvin would not have had to train his attention on that crowd that very easily could have turned violent, and trained his attention on dealing with Mr. Floyd, right? But given that the crowd was obviously hostile, the police officer's attention needs to be trained at a potential threat while dealing with the potential threat that Mr. Floyd represented. In Canada, I once carried a pistol in Canada as part of my policing duties. I also carried weapons in Afghanistan. And I will tell you that I was much more likely to go for the gun in Afghanistan than I was in Canada, because the environment in Canada is a much safer one. It's a much more permissive, safe environment. In Afghanistan, the threat was real, and it could come from very unexpected places. So it was a less permissive environment. The recourse to deadly force would be much faster. This is a reality. So let's look at Jacob Blake, right? Jacob Blake had a warrant for a sexual assault felony. And he was called because he was harassing his girlfriend, right? Threatening and harassing his girlfriend. So my acting abilities simply do not extend so far as to convince anybody I think he's an innocent victim. He resisted arrest. The police twice tried to deploy a taser to stop him via non-lethal means, right? Or less lethal means, right? So as he was moving towards his vehicle, the police told him to stop. He ignored their direction. They repeatedly told him to stop and was shot. Now, I'm supposed to shed BLM tears. Sister, please, right? The police have a duty in the prevailing circumstances to ensure he's stopped before he gets into that vehicle. A vehicle can be a very dangerous weapon. His kids were in that car. So if he gets into that car, the police very easily could have had a hostage situation on their hands. His own kids? Yes, people have used their own kids as hostages. Now, if anything had happened to these kids, who do you think would have been held responsible? This would have been a case of the police not valuing little black children's lives, right? The fact was that Jacob Blake had a weapon on the floorboards in his car. So he was going for a knife, and so as the police tell this dummy to stop, he ignores them, and you can tell yourself that he's a victim. I'm not prepared to cry on command. So are there now no circumstances where a black criminal can be shot while resisting arrest? Are the social justice warriors really prepared to delude themselves that this was an example of police brutality towards black men? Across the cities of the United States, are cities across the United States going to erupt into violence every time a black criminal thug is shot? What about other black men killed? Well, as I've said, I've given the example of Breonna Taylor and Michael Brown, this Jacob, and you can look at other similar situations that the media prepares to tell you are victims, right? You can do your own homework. So BLM and the media have deliberately lied about these. So we expect, destructive violence, we can expect, cycles of absolute riotous violence if the media continues to peddle this nonsense about systemic brutality against black people. Right? So my critics love to point out a very select data set. They say blacks are disproportionately shot by the police. Yes, that's true. Blacks are also more likely to be stopped in stop and frisk encounters. And police are more likely to stop blacks for low-level crimes. And blacks, yes, are overrepresented in prisons. Isn't this all evidence of racism? Simply put, no. Not once you've looked at the numbers, right? Oh, let's look at Chicago. Blacks are involved in 50 times the number of shootings as their white counterparts. In New York, blacks are 30 times more likely than whites to commit murder. Although blacks represent 13% of the population nationwide in the United States, they are responsible for about 50% of the homicides and 75% of robberies and assault. And it's not little black children that are committing these crimes, nor little old women or men. And very few black women are committing these violent crimes, although there have been some notable exceptions, like that black woman who attacked an Asian woman with a hammer. So this leaves a very small percentage of Americans who are very violent indeed. This is your angry young black man, and sometimes they're not so young. And need it be said, most young black men aren't violent, right? But the young black criminals who are violent are very violent and very dangerous. And it's not racist to point this out. Facts are not racist. So given their overachievement in violent crime, is it any wonder they're disproportionately involved in deadly police encounters, or is it any wonder they're overrepresented in prison? Right? They're also overrepresented in the NBA. Nobody says that that has anything to do with racism, right? Their spots in the NBA are earned, and their spots in prison, they're also earned. And the anti-police rhetoric is having very dangerous consequences. In New York, the plainclothes street unit that was responsible for 50% of all the illegal firearms police were able to remove from the street was disbanded. So this unit got rid of half of the illegal firearms in the street of New York, and this unit was disbanded. And stop and frisk was challenged in New York for disproportionately targeting people of color. Well, why exactly were police disproportionately stopping and frisking people of color? Turns out 96 to 98% of all shootings in New York are from black or Hispanics. They represent about 55% of New York's population. So should the stop and frisk program be targeting little old Jewish ladies as they walk home with their groceries? So, just so the police appear unbiased, right? The police have to focus on criminal activity in the most violent neighborhoods. They don't need to worry about little old Jewish ladies, right? They're not robbing liquor stores, and they're not gunning people down in gun-fueled violence. And yes, these crime-ridden neighborhoods, they're predominantly Black and Hispanic. So the question answers itself. The police are supposed to go where the trouble is. This is known under the inspiring name intelligence-led policing. In short, you send the assets where they're most needed. The job is to fight serious crime and not pretend that all areas of the city represent the same level of threat. So murders are up now 300% in New York. This is a direct consequence of anti-police initiatives on the part of socially sensitive politicians who, instead of standing up against BLM insanity, choose to make political points while Black people die. It's a simple calculus. A Black man killed by the police is a political liability, and the world loses its fucking mind. A Black killed is killed in crossfire, and nobody cares. And by the way, this is not a fiction. It's happening all the time. You can check yourself if you doubt me. And New York is not an isolated example. In Chicago, in Detroit, in Los Angeles, the inner city is a very dangerous place. And the police need to be there, and they need the support of city mayors and the public. As I've said, the Black community wants the police to be there. 81% in a nationwide survey of Blacks said they want the same amount of police or more police in their communities. Now take a look at how many stupid, angry white faces you saw in the BLM riots. So there's all sorts of YouTube videos available on this, and it's absolutely sickening. So these white kids, these privileged white kids, they go back to their parents' homes and live comfortably middle-class lives, and they leave the Black communities in utter ruin. All sorts of businesses are destroyed. A great many of them are Black-owned, minority-owned businesses, absolutely destroyed. And the politicians, they endorse BLM and offer their support. It's disgusting. And Kamala Harris was sending money to bail out these rioters and looters. And these politicians, they have their own security. They have their own security. They just don't want the Black community to have the policing. Right? It's unbelievable. And is there anyone who thinks about the little kids or the little old ladies living in these war zones? That needs to be you. You need to talk to your politicians and your representatives and push back on this nonsense and vote out these leftist politicians who support this toxic nonsense. And if you really cared about innocent lives, you would support the police and defend the right of communities to have adequate levels of policing. Defunding the police is a cancerous ideology, and it will result in many, many more deaths. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this YouTube video. I hope you'll support the series. Please drop a thumbs up, and please do check out my book, Deconstructing Social Justice. It's not important because I wrote it. I wrote it because the issues are important. Thank you very much.